11. Well, he's back.
That's Werner Voss.
We're going into another centennial look at what happened after that. During Bloody April, Richthofen, Jasta 11, and the Albatross D3 all came together on April 29th. The Baron was at the top of his game with 4 victories in the course of the day. And his gentlemen, who'd started out as a bunch of demoralized losers, had turned into the top scoring Jasta at the front. They contributed significantly to the British losses during Bloody April, which came to about 3 times as many as the Germans had lost overall. And they had every reason to be quite pleased with themselves. But things change. And by June of 1917, it became clear that nothing lasts forever. In fact, there were already signs that it wouldn't in April itself. On April 5th, the Baron and his Staffel attacked a group of new 2-seaters that were all tightly held together, and in a matter of what Richthofen called a cavalry charge, shot down 4 of them. Richthofen got 2 himself, and he came away very unimpressed with this new British 2-seater. But they had been poorly deployed by their flight leader, William Leaf Robinson, who didn't understand the best way to use a Bristol F2A, but later that same day, Captain Alan Wilkinson showed what would happen if you used it the right way when he led a flight of looser Bristols out, used them as what they should have been used for, a high-performance fighter with a sting in the tail, and the results were very different that same afternoon. Over the next 2 months, the Bristol fighter began to really prove its worth. Also appearing that month and making an impression was the Sopwith triplane, a highly maneuverable variation on the not-so-bad itself Sopwith Pup. New British fighters were coming out. In June, the Sopwith Camel, the first twin-gun, machine-gun armed British fighter, made its debut with the Royal Navy, number 4 Squadron. And what did the Germans have to counter this by June 1917? In late May, the Albatross D5 came out. It was a lightened D3, which I'm sure Richthofen knew from the extra wires and reinforcing needed, particularly for the single-spar lower wing of the D3, had been necessary. He probably could have told them that a lightened version of the D3 was not a good idea. But out they came. They had this smoother-looking fuselage, and it was a good-looking plane, even sleeker than its predecessors. But it wasn't long before the Germans, diving after Allied aircraft, started to notice that those wings were oscillating or even breaking and failing on them, worse than on the D3. It was the old story again, and once again the D5s were going back for a few extra wires to be added to reinforce them a bit. That was about the best they could do. It wasn't a good time to be a German pilot. It's amazing they may do as well as they did, but they did their best. They were aided a lot by their tactics, which at that time had already been to a shortened, more compact front. They had taken a completely defensive stance while hoping that matters on the Eastern Front would get better. they were taking the defensive against the Allied armies and taking the defensive against Allied aircraft. As Richthofen put it, why go, when the enemy is coming to your shop, why go out looking for customers? It saved them fuel, it saved them time and wear. And because of the west wind being against them when they were trying to get back, it meant if you shoot down an Allied plane, it's more likely to fall on your side of the lines than on theirs. And if you lose one, if you can ride it to the ground, that victory for the British might turn out to be reparable after all. All well and good, but the technical improvements represented by the Bristol fighter, the SE-5 and SE-5A, the Sopwith triplane and the Sopwith Camel, and with the French, the Spad 7 was always a good plane, especially in its 180 horsepower form, but the French were working on a cannon arm variation which would be coming out in August, as well as a twin gun version, the Spad 13. And what do the Germans have? The Albatross D5. Oh yes, and something else happened in April 1917. On April 6th, the United States declared war on Germany. So, as one means of dealing with the new challenge, on June 14th, Richthofen came in with orders to form a permanent grouping of 4 Jagdstaffeln, which on June 24th he initiated as Jagdgeschwader 1, or Fighter Wing 1. Jasta 11, his old outfit, would now be combined with the Albatrossen of Jastas 4, 6, and 10, based at the time 4 at Söhne, 6 at Bissegem, 10 at Heule, and 11 at Marke, with Richthofen as the commander of the lot. In this photo we see one of the newly arrived Albatross D5s arriving at JG1 about the time of June 24th, when JG1 was officially formed. Now the Germans had on occasion mixed and matched Jagdgruppen in certain sectors that came under threat. These were flexible units, temporary. A Staffel that was in one Jagdgruppe might be sent off to another front to fill out another. Their commanders could not really coordinate an effort this way. Very often their commanders were not even flyers until later in the war. The concept was continued, but what the Jagdgeschwader represented was something permanent, preferably under a leader who's willing to get off the desk and be up there with the planes, and above all to coordinate their efforts so they can concentrate on a given Allied formation to achieve local air superiority. Now, one of the great paradoxes of the German air service at this time is they could be so innovative, and at other times they could be so imitative. The same people who came out with the Fokker Eindecker and its synchronized machine gun and the Albatross D2 could also then be driven to copy the sesquiplane arrangement of the Nieuport 11 and 17 to produce the Albatross D3 and 5, which were not that great an improvement over the D2, really, even if they were a bit more maneuverable and had better downward visibility. And so impressed were they with the Sopwith triplane that they order everybody to come out with a triplane design. And yet they could be innovative at the same time, sometimes in ironic ways. When Fokker produces a triplane, it's the first fighter with cantilever wings, which don't need external bracing, advancing aircraft structure in a manner that will be perfected later. It's a strange, and when it comes to the Jagdgeschwader, it seems innovative, but the French had already done that on November 1st, 1916, when they formed Groupe de Combat 11, 12, and 13, the first of many, in which 4 escadrilles would be combined. I mean, in retrospect, I know what you're thinking about Germans copying the French. They were doing that. Nevertheless, Jagdgeschwader 1 was to make quite an impression of itself because, first of all, the units he got were pretty good veteran outfits to begin with. And Richthofen had a point, given the fact that JG1's purpose was to achieve local air superiority. He would think nothing of raiding other Jagdstaffeln for talent. Ernst Udet, for example, was commander of Jasta 37 when Richthofen turned up and asked him would he be interested in having a position at Jasta 11. And by that time, Udet said, I can have my bags packed by tonight, Herr Rittmeister. This was, of course, at the expense of the other Jagdstaffeln, but hey, it did give Richthofen a whole lot of stars under his aegis, and he certainly knew what to do with them, largely because of his uncanny ability to see what was going on around him, even in the height of a dogfight. And even after shooting down an Englander or two himself, he would, or fighting for his life, he would land, line up the men, congratulate one fellow on his latest victory, give a little constructive criticism to another. He didn't seem to miss a thing. He was the perfect Jagdgeschwader commander. And besides having a lot of stars in the show, the way JG1 moved, packing their stuff into trucks and heading to whichever front they were needed, or whatever part of the front would be most convenient. They seemed like a traveling circus to British intelligence, and let it be added, there were those green noses, later the black wound ribbon of Jasta 4, contrasted with the black and white tail stripes of Jasta 6 and the yellow noses of Jasta 10 and the red noses of Jasta 11. Plus all those individual colored bands and coats of arms. As far as the British were concerned, scary though it was to run into them, it looked like a flying circus. The name, of course, stuck, and when it comes to fame, well, that was that. These are some of the other examples of the aircraft that the Germans had to make do with. This is a Albatross D5 with a headrest, which most Germans soon discarded because they claimed it only interfered with their backward vision, which is important. This was flown by Ernst von Aldhaus, at that point commander of Jasta 10, and the entire Albatross has a yellow fuselage with black and white accoutrements. This is one of the independent Jastas that managed to have an elan all its own. Jasta V, which had red noses, green tails piped in red, and as you can see, some rather imaginative personal markings thrown in for good measure.
Doesn't seem like a very good way to park airplanes in the combat zone.
Well, they were far enough behind the lines to
publicity shot. They're lined up perfectly. That doesn't happen by accident.
And here's an example of a Jasta IV plane with, in this case, a yellow nose and the wound ribbon. This one brought down a prisoner with Ernst Klausnitzer aboard. And this is another independent unit, Jasta III, which I've recently discovered had red noses and often had red markings, including the big M on Karl Menkhoff's plane. But on June 6th, they came in for a bit of an unhappy shock when Richthofen himself was wounded in the head and crash-landed behind German lines on July 6, 1917. And this put him out of commission for a few weeks, but it also gave him some time to think and some time to evaluate. And he was soon putting his 2 cents in about der lausige Albatross and how it was imperative for the Germans to come up with a better fighter. After his return to the front, of course, JG-1, well, they didn't need him to resume operations. By that time, he had enough Staffelführer who knew the commander's intent to keep the Circus deadly with or without him. But in spite of the constant pain that he felt from time to time from his head wound, he couldn't have been happier to return to the front. Well, first things first. In response to another incident back in April, the declaration of war by the United States, the Germans realized that the United States had a smaller army than Portugal at the time, but they also had no illusions about the great industrial potential the United States had, and they realized that soon, one way or another, the Americans would be over in force and they would have a lot of equipment with them. What form it would take, they didn't know, but they had pretty good faith we'd come up with something good. And it was in response to this that on June 23rd, 1917, the German High Command ordered the Amerika Program. Keeping in mind Germany is still on a defensive stance, and most of the Jagdstaffeln they have are on the Western Front, where the Americans would be likely to appear. The idea was, by the summer of 1917, the Germans either had or had organized 40 Jagdstaffeln, and in the summer of 1917 they took Jagdstaffel über Ost, a kind of slap-together unit fighting the Russians all by itself, and redesignated it Jasta 81. In between that, the intention was that they would double the Jagdstaffeln with 40 more by March 1918. And their industrial capacity would be increased, they would improve the aircraft, and they would, in theory, be ready for the Americans. Hence the name. And in the summer of 1917, they got on the stick, you might say, starting, of course, with Fokker's ultimate answer to the triplane craze, the Fokker F1, in this case, a triplane with an advanced wood box cantilever structure, and yet it was a triplane with a 110 horsepower Oberrössl engine, which happened to have been, that was no coincidence. Fokker owned Oberrössl, and even from the days of the Eindecker, if he couldn't get his hands on a proper Mercedes engine, at least he had the rotary to fall back on. And it was accepted for production. It first appeared at the front, as you may remember from Werner Voss's picture at the start. Richthofen did rather well in his. He scored another 2 victories, 60 and 61. Werner Voss did even better. He scored another 10 before going down in a spectacular dogfight with SE-5As of number 56 Squadron on September 23rd. So the Germans put it into production as the D.IIIs, or DR1. Unfortunately, when it began to appear in quantity in late October 1917, the wings started failing. The ailerons started breaking. It wasn't because of any inherent problem with the structure. It was because of another feature of Fokker, lousy quality control. The things were literally rotting. The IDFLIG intervened, ordered them withdrawn, and told them to fix all that poor workmanship. By the time they would return to the front around January 1918, they'd lost a march on production, but it was still a very maneuverable plane. German pilots liked it once they got the hang of it, and in early 1918 it became the tip of the spear, as we'll soon see a rather shaky spear. For one thing, in practice during the German offensive of March 1918, it soon became clear that it couldn't keep up with most of its Allied opposition if that Allied opposition decided to disengage and bugger off, unless it was a Sopwith Camel, in which case you had a spectacular dogfight on your hands. But Richthofen noted that his Geschwader would have probably shot down 6 times as many Allied aircraft if it weren't for the fact that they could just get away anytime they wanted to. So the DR1 was not exactly a perfect answer. Even if, in the hands of a crack pilot like Werner Voss or Josef Jakobs, as late as October 1918, it could be formidable indeed. Another fallback that appeared in the same month of August 1917 was the Pfalz D.III. Pfalz, up till now, had been licensed building Roland D.IIs, which weren't all that hot. But they came out with a refined version of it, of their own design, and it was one of the most elegant-looking fighters to come out of World War I. The thing had this shark-like look. It looked like a Sesquaplane, but it wasn't really. It was a true biplane with 2 spars, just with a smaller lower wing. It looked rakish. It looked fast, just sitting on the ground. And it proved disappointing in combat once they were used, but it held together better than an Albatross D5, which made it superior for attacking enemy balloons with a better likelihood of coming back in one piece. But it was the classic case of overweight and underpowered, and just wasn't sprightly enough to handle the opposition even as well as an Albatross D5. This example is with a home defense unit, as a good many showed up.
What is it, a D3?
Yes, it's a D3. The D3, on top of that, had its machine guns fared inside the cockpit, which I guess added to the clean sleekness, but if you had a gun jam, which, let's face it, happened a lot, it was kind of hard to reach in and get at those guns to clear them. So later, by 1918, Pfalz was introducing a refined version with a slightly differently configured wing and tailplane, and reposition the guns above the fuselage in the more conventional manner so pilots could reach it, even if it isn't quite as high above as on Bruno Stachel's Pfalz in the Blue Max, but rather more than there. And in addition, in the case of both the Albatross and the Pfalz, the Germans developed a more high compression variant on the Mercedes D3 engine, the D3A, which could produce as much as 170 to 180 horsepower, and that made up for a lot of the added weight that the Albatross D5A introduced in the course of beefing itself up over the D3, and, the D5. And in the case of the Pfalz D3A, its performance was a bit improved by installing the new engine in the Pfalz D3A. Even so, the bottom line is that these aircraft were just barely competitive with their Allied counterparts. Here's an example of a D3A, in this case flown by Max Nater of Jasta 62. And here we'll get into the matter of the Amerika Program, because this is a classic example. In practice, by the time the Germans resumed the offensive in March 1918, which is supposed to be the big payoff, they have increased their units by 2 more Jagdgeschwader. Jagdgeschwader II, made of Jastas 12, 13, 15, and 19 under Hauptmann Adolf Ritter von Tuchik, formerly of Jasta 12, and JG3 under Oberleutnant Bruno Lörzer, combining Jasta Belke 26, 27, and 36. Now, one of the reasons it took so long for them to put out 2 more Jagdgeschwader was they had to do a bit of hunting and observing to find a leader capable of leading 4 Staffel in action with the same effectiveness that that Richthofen did, and still manage the administrative side of it. Richthofen was a tough act to follow, but eventually they found von Tuchik and Lörzer and gave them the job. Now, these 3 units at various parts of the front were the vanguard of establishing air superiority. And as I said, the shaft of the spear, and I use that in more ways than one, were the other Jagdstaffel. Now, the Germans increased their production as best they could. And as you'll note, it was for more than one airplane because they were hedging their bets. The Pfalz was basically a 3rd string aircraft, but it was in production because the Germans needed every halfway decent fighter they could get, even then. By the time of March 1918, therefore, you have the Jagdgeschwader with the good stuff, Albatross, Fokker DR1s, and in the case of Richthofen, he was hedging his bets by keeping some Albatross and Pfalz around simply because they had more speed. But he had another reason too. By that time, they had had the fighter competition of January 1918, and they'd finally come up with something that impressed him. Big time. The Fokker D.VII. He was looking forward to getting his hands on that. And for that reason, so that there would be some men still experienced in using inline engines, like the Mercedes driving the Fokker D.VII, that he kept in Jasta 4 and 10, he was keeping the inline engines on hand, so to make for an easier transition.
John, what did you say this was a Pfalz?
No, this is an Albatross D5A, which was the reinforced version that had considering the D3 was supposed to be a lightened version, the D3A had returned to about the same weight as the D3 in the course of beefing up the lower wing and adding more wires, and also reverting from an upper aileron control to the same kind of wires from the lower wing control that marked the D3. Now mind you, some Germans were so unimpressed with the D5A that some of them preferred to keep the old, by that time, reliable D3, especially the ones built by the Albatross D.Vs, which for some reason were held together rather well. But the D5A turned out to be the most produced German fighter of the war, and it was the one that was, when in doubt, being handed off to these new Amerika Program units like Jasta 62, whose aircraft were black with red noses, and Netar has a patriotic German flag on the side of his aircraft. He would end up with 25 victories. But the thing with the Amerika Program units was with the lower Jastas, and particularly JG1, raiding all the experienced men, the Germans had also established a second specific fighter school at Valenciennes and expected it to be up to 50 aircraft on strength. Of course, they were also expecting each Jagdstaffel to be fully stocked with 18 aircraft, but how often did that happen? Not very much, even in their best days. They were producing as best they could all these different planes and handing them out to the units and training pilots as quick as they could to make up for the fact that their older system of finding a good, talented, aggressive pilot in a two-seater unit and then giving him a quick crash course and then putting him in a fighter unit. Now they were specifically training them and sending them off to these Amerika Program units where they were completely inexperienced, to be led by, in theory at least, by a cadre of experienced men, or at least some extraordinarily skillful men with some leadership qualities. In theory, that was the idea. In practice, have you ever noticed how many Amerika Program Jastas have the leader scoring the plurality or even majority of victories? That's no accident. These fellows had a major learning curve ahead of them when they went into combat, and how good the commander was is in instilling his skills and spirit on them was varied from unit to unit. Not everybody was a Richthofen. This is another example of an Albatross D5A. Notice the added strut at the bottom of the V strut as an attempt to further reinforce that single spar lower wing. It was your standard varnished wood with black triangles above and below as the unit marking for them. Now here's an interesting example of an Amerika Program unit, Jasta 50, that is entirely equipped with OAW-built Albatross D3s. The plane is still good, even though it's far behind the times chronologically. But at the time, what else did they have? They made do with what they had on hand. Here's an example of a Pfalz D3A, in this case from Jagdstaffel 77B. In this case, that silvery gray finish with blue and red markings added. make out the machine gun on the upper decking, and you might note that the lower wing is a bit rounder than the original shark-like D3. These upper 77, 78, 79, and 80 were Bavarian units, which brings up another interesting change in the Luftstreitskräfte late in 1917. Some of their duchies insisted on having units devoted to the duchy itself. They thought it would be better for morale, although Erich Hüttner, the commander of the Luftstreitskräfte, regarded it more as an act of sabotage. But nevertheless, there would be units that would be Bavarian with a little B after the number, or Württemberg with a little W, or Saxon with a little S. And all the others were soon to be Prussian. In practice, it was not unusual to see a Bavarian like Hans Weiss leading a Prussian unit like Jasta 11 if Richthofen had poached him. But in theory, that's what these units were, just to add to the confusion. Here's Hauptmann von Tuchik's Fokker DR1 40417 ready for flight. He scored 2 victories in the plane before he was shot down and killed in a fight with SE-5As of number 24 Squadron on March 15th, 1918. So JG2 is barely out the gate and it's down a commander. His successor, though, would be Hauptmann Rudolph Berthold, who arrived on March 19th from Jasta 18. And Berthold was exactly, in spite of a withered right arm, and a fanatical and martinet disposition, Berthold was nevertheless just the sort of aggressive madman needed to inspire JG2. In addition, he came up with one of the most outrageous ideas for, or conditions for joining up in the war. When he came in with his unit of red-nosed, blue-tailed Albatrossen, which were based on the cuff and jacket of his old cavalry unit, he insisted on keeping the scheme and the men and the planes. So instead of doing any other changing, he just put Jasta 18 in there and changed the name to Jasta 15. And all the men who had been there, well, they were now an independent Jasta 18 in his place. Furthermore, he would end up having all the planes in his unit with blue tails and noses of whatever color was relevant. In the case of 12, white, like the cowling of von Tuchik's DR1. In the case of 13, it would be green, and in the case of 19, it would be yellow. And under Berthold's command, they would be the terror of the French front until he crashed on August 10th, 1918, badly injured his arm again, was sent off to hospital and replaced by the less than aggressive Rittmeister der Reserve Heinz Freiherr von Bredelov. But barely had Bredelov taken over when Berthold turns up again, goes into the office for a few words with him. Bredelov amiably gives up command back to Berthold, and he takes over until August 12th, when a letter comes direct from Kaiser Wilhelm II telling Berthold to get back in that hospital and not come back until he is well again. At which point, after serving under some serving commanders, on August 31st, Oberleutnant Oskar Freiherr von Birnig takes over the unit. This is von Kuchik at the height of his game, and that's Berthold, who would leave his influence on it thereafter. And this is Jasta 18 at about the time it was transitioning into Jasta 15. Berthold's winged sword is on a Pfalz D.III. The rest of them are Albatross D5As. The 4D of Olafur von Bolje Markenay can be seen in the picture, among others. This is about the time they became the vanguard of JG2. And the only Jagdgeschwader of the first generation whose commander lasted out the entire war was JG3 under Oberleutnant Bruno Lörzer, who had been commander of Jasta 26, command of the unit which you saw earlier, went to his brother. Why does it not go the other way? There we go. These are the black and white marked Jasta 26 DR1s. And in addition, there was 27 under his good buddy, Oberleutnant Hermann Göring. And Jasta Belke, which was under a number of leaders before settling with Karl Bola. And Jasta 36, which also went through its share of leaders and tends to be a rather overlooked unit, just doing its bit. But I highly recommend Greg van Weingarten's Osprey book on the subject for those who want to know more about that unit. In 1918, the German quest for more aircraft to fill out its units in general continued with the fighter competition of January 1918, whose winner was the Fokker D.VII, but which also produced aircraft such as the Siemens Schucker D3 and D4, which is shown on the far left, which was an outstanding fast climbing interceptor when its engine wasn't seizing up. It was a rotary radial engine which really played hell on the artificial lubricant available to the Germans, and most of them ended up doing home defense. But Jasta 12 had some on strength, and so did 15 and 19 at one time or another. Another similar plane was put out by Pfalz, the Pfalz D.VIII. This one is being flown by Paul Bäumer of Jasta Belke in May 1918. And another with Jasta 56. Only about 20 of these were built. They weren't as good as the Siemens Schucker design, but they produced some and they sent them off because something had to fill the ranks in the Amerika Program units. Fokker tried to improve on the D7 by putting out a parasol monoplane, the E5, and once again it performed very well in August 1918 until the wings started failing and a couple of people were killed in crashes, and it was the old Fokker story all over again, and they had to be withdrawn and the quality control revised and a new set of wings devised that would not break up, and it returned to the front in late October as the D8, but it never really got a chance to show what it could do. Another entry from LFG Roland was the Klinkerrumpf fuselaged Roland D.VI, which had wood slats like a boat to produce its fuselage. In this case, with Bavarian Jasta 23, as flown by Otto Kissenberg. This was one of the few units that had a lot of those on hand. This, too, was put into production to fill out the Amerika Program units, or the whatever unit would accept them. According to Germans who flew it, it was a good plane, about comparable to a D5A. Nothing like a Fokker D.VII, but then what was? But there weren't enough Fokker D.VIIs to go around yet. And Pfalz put out another attempt, the D.12, which in this case is with Jasta 77B. It appeared a lot in Bavarian units, and in the opinion of Rudolph Stark, commander of Yassa 35B, after wearing out his D7s on September 1st, 1918, they got replacements in the form of Pfalz D.12s, to which he said, "What on earth is a Pfalz D.12?" and concluded, "The whole contraption looks like a harp. We're spoiled for such things, especially our ground crewmen with the extra work that all those external bracing wires produce after being spoiled on the D7. He did admit that it was somewhat faster in level flight than the D7, believe it or not. It wasn't as maneuverable. He described the D7 as a thoroughbred, whereas the D12 was an obedient plow horse that had to be manhandled to fight in. But here again was a plane that was put into production near the end of the war simply because they had to do something to fill out the Amerika Program units. So by September 1918, the Germans certainly have their 81 Jastas, but the quality of them is inconsistent, to say the least. And the Jagdgeschwader are going from front to front. As for JG1, as all of us Blue Max fans probably know, Manfred von Richthofen finally had the law of averages catch up with him on April 21st, 1918. Hauptmann Wilhelm Reinhardt of Jasta VI promptly took over as a result of being the sole thing mentioned in the Red Baron's will that Reinhardt take over command. And he led it quite ably until July 3rd, 1918, when he test flew a Zeppelin Lindau D1 and the wings fell off. And on that same day, he was replaced by a fairly successful Staffelführer for Jasta 27 by the name of Hermann Göring, who would see them through to the end of the war. By the end of the war, JG3 was busy fighting the British, and both JG2 and JG1 were fighting over the Meuse-Argonne sector, mostly against the Americans. As for the Amerika Program units, they were filling in wherever they could. It's doubtful that even the most elite German units had the entire strength of 18 aircraft stipulated by the Amerika Program. Let's just say it was a great idea in theory, but with blockaded Germany trying to gear for war in reality, maybe not so much. Anyway, it was the beginning of those two phenomena that occurred 100 years ago this month. Any questions? From each.